Welcome to Negotiate Value Lesson 10. We're at the midpoint of the course. We're wrapping up the module Know Thy Benefit, all about knowing what drives your value. And we're moving into the module Push the Potential, which is about identifying your options and developing your options. And I'm going to ask you a strange question that actually bridges those two modules. When's the last time you heard an ultimatum? Well, you probably heard an ultimatum or two growing up, maybe something like clean up that room or else, or don't make me stop this car, or my favorite from the old TV show, please don't make me angry. You won't like me when I'm angry. You remember that? It sounds like a threat. It is a threat, in fact. It's also a negotiation tactic. In these cases, we're having negotiations about behavior, saying, I want this kind of behavior or there'll be this kind of consequence. There's this desired outcome, and then there's an or else. And what we're talking about in this lesson is that or else. What happens when he stops the car, when he gets angry? Or more to the point, what happens when you don't get the price you want in a negotiation? What happens when you ask for a little bit too much and the other party walks away from the table? Well, what that is, what your options are going to very much determine your success in negotiating, especially when you know them ahead of time. So we're going to talk about that in today's lesson. And the great thing is, we don't really have to fear the or else anymore. We're going to go through a homework exercise that's going to teach you to take a little of the pressure out of that or else and move forward with more confidence. So let's talk about the key term here, which is BATNA, B-A-T-N-A. You probably heard this before. It's an acronym, and it simply means the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If you don't come to agreement, if you don't have a meeting of the minds, if you come to loggerheads, then what happens? Your BATNA happens. That's where your options play in. And the better your BATNA is, the more power you have in the negotiation. So let's play that out in what could be a real-life negotiation. Let's say that you wanted to build a deck on your house. You had a carpenter come and give an estimate for the deck. His estimate was $3,000. That sounded like too much to you, so you countered. You say, well, I think you should do it for $2,000. I'll pay $2,000. And he says, no, I'll come down to $2,800 and I'll do it next week, but that's the best I can do. And you say, well, how about $2,400? Would you do it for that? But he says no. And that's really all you want to pay. So what happens then? There's no agreement, and you haven't come to a price that works. Now, what happens then really depends on your BATNA. It depends on what your options are, what your BATNA is. So if you're in a position where you've got 2 more appointments with carpenters that afternoon, and you've got a previous estimate in hand for $2,500 to build the deck, then that $2,800 price doesn't look so great. And you might say, see you later, buddy. I'm going to go on and work with somebody else. Now, let's imagine a different scenario. Let's say you've been trying for months to get somebody to come and look and just give an estimate. It's hard enough to do that. He's the only guy that you've been able to see. He can do it next week. And the following weekend, you've got family coming in from out of town and you're hosting a family reunion and you want to use that deck. So that's a different situation where the alternatives to not agreeing with this carpenter are not nearly as good. And so you might be motivated to go ahead and pay more than you want to get the deal done and to move forward. Now that's an example of the BATNA in action. What we've been going through in this module of Negotiate Value is all about the benefit, what drives the benefit, the characteristics of the benefit, and ultimately what goals you're moving toward with the purchase. Now let's apply this to this scenario we were just talking about, the deck. So if your goal with the deck is to make more use of your backyard, well then maybe there are a few more options. Maybe you could build a patio, but maybe, or maybe you can just use some other vendors. But you need to know what the benefit is and what the goal is and what you're moving toward. Now, let's say the goal was to increase the value of the house. That's a different goal, and that gives you different options. Perhaps you could take that money instead and put it into the kitchen or do something else with it. And it may mean you have more flexibility than just building the deck. So this is how the work that we've done in defining our benefit and understanding the features and the goals, all this fits into more options and knowing what you can do and what other choices you have when you're in a negotiation. Now, as we look forward, we're going to be talking about developing more options, how innovation plays into the shopping process and finding different solutions as well as different vendors gives you more options. We'll talk about how to find options when it doesn't seem like there are any. And then finally, how to evaluate the options side by side to know which one not necessarily is the lowest cost, but brings you the most value. And that might be the lowest cost or that might not be the lowest cost, but it's going to be the one which overall brings you the greatest difference between the benefit and the price. So that's what the next module is all about, and that brings us to the homework. The homework for this lesson is the worst case scenario. You'll find this is a very liberating exercise, especially where you might fear a negotiation that's coming up. A lot of us tend to overplay the negative that might come out of a negotiation, so much so that we don't even negotiate. We don't ask for the things that we could get or that we want because we're afraid of the outcomes. But most of us usually aren't in a Hulk situation where bodily harm might ensue, right, if we ask for too much. Or we might get in a fight, or they might throw things at us or shoot bullets at us. In most cases, our impacts, our outcomes are much less severe than that. And this exercise can help you get that on the table and gain confidence to go forward. So what we're looking at for a couple of negotiations that are coming up or that you could enter into is what the negotiation is, what the worst case is that could come out of that, and then what that means. What would be the next steps if you did have the worst case happen? So let's start with a classic negotiation of a higher starting salary. And a friend of mine was talking to me yesterday about a job offer she'd received where the starting salary was quite a bit lower than what she expected. We were talking about, well, what would it mean to go back and ask them for a lot more money? And what's the worst thing that could come out of that? And really, we're pretty sure that the worst thing that could come out of that would be the answer no. It's unlikely that they withdraw the offer. It's much more likely that they might say, well, here's a concession, we'll meet you partway, or I'm sorry, that's as high as we can go. But what then would be the next steps if they did say no? And what my friend realized is that really she'd do one of two things. She'd either go ahead and take the offer at that price that was lower than she really wanted, or she'd keep looking around for job opportunities. And that was it. So let's now look at a second negotiation. And let's say you're negotiating the site of a family vacation. Maybe one has been agreed upon, and then you think you have a better idea, so you want to go back and reopen that. Now, is this a big-time, high-pressure negotiation? Well, it depends on your family. It could be, right? And what's the worst thing that could happen out of that negotiation? Probably the worst thing is that people could say no, that ultimately the location would stay the same, and that your request would be rebuffed. And then what happens? What's the actions that would come out of that? Well, it's really one of two things. You'd either go anyway to the location that wasn't your first choice, or you wouldn't go. That's it. Now, this is a very simple exercise, but it actually comes out of a book by Dale Carnegie called Stop Worrying and what's it called? How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. And that book includes a number of exercises that are very practical to get over your fear of the negative outcomes that might come, and that actually gives you confidence to ask for more. So I recommend that. What you'll find is that in most cases, your BATNA, your options, if the negotiation doesn't come through, are probably not as bad as you thought. And if your alternatives aren't that good, if your options aren't so great, well, that's okay, because in the entire next module, we're going to go into how to make more options and how to make them better. So I'll see you in Chapter 11.